The gilded chains. Era knelt on the smooth marble floor of the grand hall, her hands trembling as she adjusted the intricate gold chain that hung around her neck. The chain was not just an accessory, it was her prison. Each link was a reminder that she was no more than property to the alien overlord who ruled this world. She had been taken from Earth during the Great Harvest, a time when humanity had been defeated and sold into slavery across the galaxy. The hall was alive with activity. Alien nobles of every kind. Tall, slim beings with glowing skin, others covered in thick scales, and a few whose faces seemed to shift like liquid, milled about, chatting in low voices. They were here for one purpose, the auction. Era's owner, Lord Krath, stood at the head of the room, his massive figure towering over the crowd. His sharp, insect-like features glinted under the chandelier's soft light. He was speaking in a booming voice, boasting about his collection of human slaves. To these aliens, humans were exotic pets, status symbols, or tools to flaunt their power. Now, Krath announced, his 4 eyes scanning the room, I present my prized possession. A human unlike any other, obedient, beautiful, and perfectly trained. A treasure to add to your collection. Era felt the weight of every eye in the room as Krath gestured toward her. Her heart raced. She hated this. Hated being paraded like an object. But disobedience meant punishment. Punishment she had learned to fear. The crowd parted as a figure entered the hall. Unlike the others, this newcomer was wrapped in a long cloak, his face hidden by a shadowy hood. He moved with purpose, his steps calm and deliberate. The air seemed to change around him, as if the room itself recognized his presence. "Who is that?" whispered one of the aliens. "No idea, but he's not from around here," another replied. The cloaked man stopped in front of Krath, his gaze briefly flickering toward Era. For a split second, she thought she saw something unusual in his eyes. They weren't filled with the greed or hunger she was used to. Instead, there was something softer, something human. "You're interested in this one?" Krath asked, his voice tinged with amusement. "She's expensive, not for the faint of heart." The man's voice was calm and steady. "I'll take her." A murmur rippled through the crowd. It wasn't just the boldness of his words. It was the tone, the quiet authority that seemed out of place in a hall full of alien aristocrats. Krath tilted his head, intrigued. "You don't even want to inspect the merchandise." "She is human," the man said simply. "That is enough." Era's heart pounded. Who was this man? Why would he buy her without even asking questions? Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was he a collector of humans? A sadist looking for a new plaything? Or something worse? Krath laughed, his deep voice echoing through the hall. "You must be very wealthy to make such a careless purchase." The man reached into his cloak and produced a small glowing crystal. The room fell silent. Era didn't know much about alien technology, but even she could sense the power radiating from the crystal. Whatever it was rare and valuable enough to silence the smug Krath. "Done," Krath said, snatching the crystal. "She's yours." Before Era could react, 2 of Krath's guards grabbed her arms and pulled her toward the cloaked man. She stumbled, her legs weak from fear and confusion. As she approached, the man finally lowered his hood. Era froze. He was human. A million questions flooded her mind, but she couldn't speak. She simply stared at him, her thoughts a jumbled mess of hope and doubt. A human. Here. Why? How? The man leaned closer, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You're safe now." Safe? Era didn't believe him. Couldn't believe him. She had been a slave for so long that the word safe felt like a cruel joke. But something about his tone, calm, firm, and undeniably human, made her chest tighten with a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. "Let's go," he said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. The room buzzed with whispers as the man led her toward the exit. Era glanced back at Krath, who was already boasting about his next auction item. He didn't care about her anymore. She was nothing to him, and maybe that was a good thing. As they stepped out into the cold night air, Era looked up at the man. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he guided her toward a small, unassuming ship parked in the distance. Only when they were safely inside did he finally speak. "My name is Draven," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm here to set you free." Era stared at him, her mind spinning. Could she trust him? What did free even mean in a galaxy that saw humans as nothing more than property? But as the ship's engines roared to life, and they left Krath's palace behind, Era felt something she hadn't felt in years, a small, flickering ember deep within her heart. Maybe, just maybe, this man was telling the truth. The escape. Era sat rigid in the co-pilot's seat, her hands clutching the armrests as Draven's ship shot into the dark void of space. The alien overlord's palace had vanished behind them, swallowed by the swirling clouds of the planet's atmosphere. But she could still feel the weight of Krath's presence, like a shadow lingering over her. The cabin hummed with the sound of the ship's engines. Draven worked the controls with precision, his movements sharp and focused. He hadn't spoken much since they left. Era didn't know if that was a good sign or a bad one. She finally broke the silence. "You said you were here to set me free. Why?" Draven didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the control panel. "Because no one else will." Era frowned. His answer wasn't enough. Nothing about this situation made sense. "Do you even know me?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Why would you risk so much for someone you've never met?" Draven sighed, leaning back in his seat. "You're not just someone. You're human. That's reason enough." Era blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of his words. She wanted to argue, to question him further, but something about the way he said it, the quiet conviction in his voice, left her silent. The ship's console beeped suddenly, snapping her out of her thoughts. Draven's expression darkened as he leaned forward, his fingers flying over the controls. "What's wrong?" Era asked, her chest tightening. "We've got company," he said grimly. Era turned the viewport. Her stomach dropped. A massive warship was closing in on them, its sleek, black hull bristling with weapons. She recognized it immediately. It was Krath's flagship. "How did they find us so fast?" she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "They always find you fast," Draven said, his tone flat. "That's why we need to be faster." He yanked the controls, and the ship lurched to the side. Era grabbed the armrests again, her heart pounding as the stars outside blurred into streaks of light. The warship opened fire. Bright streaks of plasma lit up the void, each one narrowly missing their small ship. The cabin rattled with every near hit, and Era's breath came in short gasps. "Can't this thing go any faster?" she shouted. Draven smirked, his calmness unnerving in the chaos. "Hold on." He flipped a series of switches, and the ship's engines roared louder. Era felt herself pushed back into her seat as they surged forward, dodging another volley of plasma. She clenched her jaw, her fingers digging into the armrests. She hated feeling helpless. The warship didn't let up. Its cannons fired relentlessly, each blast growing closer and closer. Draven swerved and weaved, but the smaller ship wasn't built for prolonged combat. It was only a matter of time before Krath's hunters caught up. "Why are they chasing us so hard?" Era asked, her voice trembling. "I'm just one slave. I'm not worth this." Draven's expression hardened. "You don't understand. To them, you're not just a slave. You're a symbol. Every human they lose is a crack in their empire. If we escape, it shows others that freedom is possible. That's why they can't let us go." Era stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. Freedom. She had never dared to dream of it. Now it felt close enough to touch, but still impossibly far. A sudden explosion rocked the ship, snapping her back to reality. The lights flickered, and the console sparked. Draven cursed under his breath. They hit the engines, he muttered. We've got to land. Land? Where? Era asked, panic rising. There's nothing out here but. Her words died as the ship's sensors pinged. A planet loomed ahead, its surface covered in jagged mountains and swirling red clouds. It looked hostile, unwelcoming. There, Draven said, steering toward the planet. Era's stomach churned as the ship descended. The warship followed, its weapons still firing. Draven gritted his teeth, his hands tight on the controls. Brace yourself, he shouted. The ship plunged through the atmosphere, flames licking the viewport as they hurtled toward the surface. Era squeezed her eyes shut, her breath coming in short gasps. She felt the ship jolt as it hit something hard. When she opened her eyes, everything was still. The cabin was filled with smoke, and the smell of burning metal stung her nose. She coughed, unbuckling her harness and stumbling to her feet. Draven, she called, her voice shaky. I'm fine, he said, his voice coming from the cockpit. He was already checking the console, his movements quick and purposeful. Engines are fried. We're stuck here for now. Era looked out the viewport. The landscape was harsh and alien, the ground cracked and dry, with jagged cliffs rising in every direction. The sky was a sickly red, and strange shapes moved in the distance, creatures she couldn't identify. What is this place? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. An uncharted planet, Draven said. No settlements, no patrols. It's the best chance we got. Era didn't feel reassured. The planet didn't look like it offered a chance for anything but death. But before she could voice her doubts, a low, guttural growl echoed outside the ship. Draven's head snapped up. He grabbed a weapon from under the console and turned to her. Stay close, he said, his voice low and urgent. Era's pulse quickened as the growling grew louder. She had thought the aliens on Kraft's planet were terrifying. Now she realized they were nothing compared to what might be waiting for them out here. The chase. The air outside the crashed ship was thick and bitter, carrying a strange metallic tang that stung Era's throat with every breath. The ground beneath her feet was cracked and blackened, as if fire had consumed this world long ago. Jagged cliffs loomed in the distance, their sharp edges cutting into the crimson sky. The growls she had heard earlier grew louder, echoing off the barren landscape. Draven stood at the base of the ship's ramp, his weapon, a sleek, alien-looking rifle, held steady in his hands. His eyes scanned the horizon, sharp and focused. He didn't look afraid. He looked ready. What's out there? Era asked, her voice low. Trouble, Draven replied. This planet's uncharted for a reason. The creatures here don't like visitors. As if on cue, a shadow moved among the jagged rocks ahead. Era froze, her breath hitching. The shape was massive, with long, spindly limbs that moved unnaturally, like a spider walking on two legs. Its glowing yellow eyes locked onto them, and it let out a bone-chilling screech that made Era's stomach twist. What is that? She whispered. Draven didn't answer. Instead, he raised his weapon and fired. The blast of energy struck the creature square in the chest, sending it sprawling backward. But before Era could feel a shred of relief, more shadows emerged from the cliffs. Half a dozen, maybe more. Each one was as large and terrifying as the first. Inside. Now. Draven barked, shoving her toward the ship. Era didn't argue. She scrambled up the ramp, her heart pounding as the creatures charged toward them. Draven fired again, each shot precise and controlled, but it wasn't enough. For every creature he took down, two more appeared, their screeches filling the air. As soon as they were inside, Draven slammed the hatch shut and bolted it. The creature's claws scraped against the metal, the sound grating and relentless. Era backed away, her hands trembling. They're going to get in, she said, her voice cracking. Draven shook his head, already moving toward the cockpit. Not if we move fast. "The ship's broken," she protested, following him. "The engines are," he corrected. "But the boosters still work. If we can make it to those cliffs, we might lose them." "Might," she echoed, her panic rising. Draven didn't respond. He was already flipping switches and pressing buttons on the console. The ship groaned and shuddered as the boosters fired, propelling them forward with a jolt. Era stumbled, grabbing onto the back of Draven's seat for balance. Through the viewport, she could see the creatures chasing them. They moved with terrifying speed, their limbs bending in ways that defied logic. One leaped onto the ship, its claws scraping against the hull. Era let out a sharp gasp as its glowing eyes peered into the viewport, filled with hunger and malice. "Hold on," Draven shouted. He yanked the controls, sending the ship into a sharp turn. The creature lost its grip and tumbled to the ground, but more were still following, their screeches growing louder. "We're not going to make it," Era said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, we are," Draven said, his tone firm. "You just have to trust me." Era wanted to trust him, but every instinct in her body screamed that this was the end. The creatures were too fast, too relentless, and even if they managed to reach the cliffs, what then? The ship wouldn't hold out forever. The cliffs loomed closer, their jagged edges casting long shadows across the barren ground. Draven pushed the boosters to their limit, the ship shaking violently as it sped toward the narrow gap between the rocks. "They won't follow us in there," he said, his voice strained. "Why not?" Era asked. "You don't want to know." Before she could press him further, the ship hurtled into the gap. The walls of the cliffs closed in around them, the sharp edges scraping against the hull. Era gritted her teeth, bracing herself as sparks flew, and the ship groaned in protest. The creatures skidded to a halt outside the cliffs, their screeches turning into frustrated growls. They didn't follow, just as Draven had predicted, but their retreat didn't bring Era any comfort. "What now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Draven shut down the boosters, letting the ship glide to a stop. He turned to her, his expression grim. "We wait. They won't come in here, but we're not safe yet." Era's stomach churned. What's in here that even they are afraid of? Draven didn't answer right away. He grabbed a flashlight from a compartment and checked the charge on his weapon. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and tense. "This planet used to belong to an ancient race," he said. "They're gone now, but their defenses are still active. The creatures out there know better than to cross into their territory." "Defenses," Era repeated, dread creeping into her voice. Draven nodded. "Traps. Machines. Things that kill anything that moves." Era stared at him, her blood running cold. "So we're trading one kind of death for another." Draven met her gaze, his expression steady. "We'll survive," he said. "But you're going to have to trust me." Era wanted to argue, to scream that trust wasn't something she could give so easily. But something in Draven's eyes, calm, determined, unyielding, made her swallow her fear. Outside the ship, the shadows deepened as the cliffs seemed to close in around them. The screeches of the creatures faded, replaced by an eerie silence. It wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that promised something worse. Survival bond. Era's footsteps echoed in the narrow canyon as she followed Draven through the jagged cliffs. The air here was colder, and the silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional hiss of wind through the rocks. The path was narrow, lined with strange glowing symbols carved into the walls. The symbols pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of something ancient and alive. "Stay close," Draven whispered, his voice low and urgent. His weapon was raised, his eyes scanning every shadow. Era tightened her grip on the metal rod he had handed her, a makeshift weapon he'd pulled from the ship's wreckage. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "What are we looking for?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Anything that moves," Draven replied. "And traps. The people who built this place didn't leave it unprotected. As if on cue, the ground beneath them shifted slightly. Era froze, her breath catching. Draven held up a hand, signaling for her to stop. He crouched, examining the ground ahead. "Pressure plates," he muttered. "Step on one, and we're dead." Era's heart raced as she looked around, trying to spot the plates he was talking about. The ground looked the same to her, smooth, dusty, and unremarkable. She didn't understand how Draven could see the danger. "How do you know where they are?" she asked. Draven didn't look up. "You don't survive out here without learning a few things." It wasn't much of an answer, but Era didn't push. She followed his lead, carefully placing her feet where he did, her body tense with every step. The glow of the ancient symbols grew brighter as they moved deeper into the canyon, casting eerie patterns on the walls. "What is this place?" Era asked, unable to keep the curiosity out of her voice. Draven glanced at her briefly. "A ruin. Long before the overlords, there was a race that ruled this part of the galaxy. No one knows what happened to them, but they left their weapons behind. That's why no one colonized this planet. It's too dangerous." Era shivered. "So we're walking into a death trap." Draven smirked faintly. "Pretty much." They walked in silence for a while, the tension between them thick. Era could feel the weight of her questions pressing down on her, but she didn't know where to start. Why was Draven risking so much for her? Why did he care about humans when so many others had abandoned them? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint clicking sound. Draven froze, his head snapping toward the source. Era followed his gaze and saw movement in the shadows ahead. "What is it?" she whispered, gripping the metal rod tightly. "Something alive," Draven murmured. "And big." The clicking grew louder, joined by a low, rumbling growl. A massive shape emerged from the darkness, its body covered in sleek, metallic armor. It looked like a fusion of machine and beast, its glowing red eyes fixed on them. Draven raised his weapon, but he didn't fire. "Don't move," he said softly. "It's a guardian." Era's breath caught. "A what?" "Automated defense," Draven explained. "It's scanning us. If it decides we're a threat, we're done." Era stayed perfectly still, her muscles aching from the tension. The guardian's glowing eyes swept over them, its body humming with energy. She could feel the heat radiating from it, the power thrumming beneath its armored surface. After what felt like an eternity, the guardian let out a mechanical hiss and turned away, disappearing back into the shadows. Era exhaled shakily. Why didn't it attack us? Draven lowered his weapon, his expression thoughtful. It must have recognized we weren't part of the Overlord's forces. These machines were designed to defend against invaders, not scavengers like us. Era wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse. She glanced at the path ahead, her stomach twisting with dread. If one guardian could be avoided, what else might be waiting for them? They continued deeper into the canyon, the walls narrowing until they were forced to walk single file. The glowing symbols grew brighter, casting flickering shadows across the rocky ground. Era couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Eventually, they came to a wide chamber carved into the cliffside. In the center of the chamber stood a massive obelisk, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols. The air here was heavy, charged with a strange energy that made Era's skin tingle. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Draven approached the obelisk cautiously, his eyes scanning its surface. "A beacon," he said finally. "Or a weapon. Maybe both." Era frowned. "How can you not know?" Draven smirked faintly. "No one knows what these things were for. But if we can activate it, it might send out a signal strong enough to call for help. Or bring the overlords right to us," Era pointed out. Draven nodded. "It's a gamble. But we're out of options." Era hesitated, her eyes flicking between Draven and the obelisk. She didn't like the idea of relying on something so ancient and mysterious, but she couldn't deny that they were running out of choices. "Fine," she said finally. But if this thing kills us, I'm blaming you." Draven chuckled. "Fair enough." As he began examining the obelisk, Era took a step back, her eyes scanning the chamber. The air felt heavier here, the silence oppressive. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line, that activating the obelisk would awaken something best left undisturbed. Her instincts were proven right when the ground beneath her feet began to shake. The glow of the obelisk intensified, filling the chamber with blinding light. And from the shadows, the clicking sound returned, louder, faster, and closer than before. Era's heart pounded as she turned to Draven. "What did you do?" Draven didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the obelisk, his face pale. "Run," he said, his voice barely audible. Before Era could respond, the chamber was filled with the deafening roar of something ancient and angry waking from its slumber. Betrayal and truth. The roar reverberated through the chamber like a physical force, shaking the walls and sending small rocks tumbling from the cliffs above. Era stumbled, her hand scrambling to steady herself against the vibrating ground. The glow of the obelisk pulsed wildly, and from its base, ancient mechanisms began to move. Gears the size of boulders ground to life, spitting sparks and filling the air with a metallic screech. Draven grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the path they had come from. "Move," he shouted. Era barely had time to react before a massive shape emerged from the darkness. It was another guardian, but this one dwarfed the one they had encountered earlier. Its body was sleek and predatory, its limbs ending in wicked, scythe-like blades. A glowing core pulsed in its chest, the same eerie light as the obelisk. "This one's not scanning," Era cried as it charged toward them, its movements impossibly fast for its size. "It's defending the obelisk," Draven shouted, raising his weapon. He fired, but the shots bounced harmlessly off the creature's armor, leaving only faint scorch marks. "It's not invincible, but we can't take it head-on." Era didn't need to be told twice. She ran, her heart pounding as the creature's scythe-like limbs slashed at the ground behind her. The walls of the chamber narrowed into a canyon again, forcing them to weave through tight spaces and uneven terrain. The guardian gave chase, its blades carving through the rock as if it were paper. Era's breath came in short gasps as she pushed herself to keep up with Draven, who moved with the precision of someone used to running for his life. "Left," Draven shouted, ducking into a side passage. Era followed, the path so narrow she could feel the rough stones scraping her shoulders. The guardian tried to follow, but its massive frame got stuck, its blades screeching against the walls as it struggled to free itself. For a moment, the world was silent except for the guardian's frustrated roars. Era leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Draven wiped sweat from his brow. "An enforcer. Some of the ruins have them. They're programmed to kill anything that activates the wrong systems." Era glared at him. "And you didn't think to warn me?" Draven shrugged, though there was a flicker of guilt in his eyes. "Didn't know it was here. These things don't always wake up." Before Era could respond, a new sound filled the air, a rhythmic pounding, like the footsteps of an army. Her stomach twisted as she turned toward the source. "Tell me that's not another one," she said. Draven's jaw tightened. "It's worse." Emerging from the shadows of the canyon were figures clad in dark armor, their weapons glinting in the dim light. At their head was a hulking figure with glowing eyes and a familiar insectoid face. "Krath, you've led me on quite the chase, human," Krath hissed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Did you really think you could escape me?" Era's blood ran cold. She turned to Draven, her voice a sharp whisper. "How did he find us?" Draven didn't answer. His face was pale, his eyes darting toward the narrow path ahead. He grabbed her wrist. "Run." "No," she said, yanking her arm free. "You knew. You knew he was following us. You led him here." Draven's expression darkened. "It's not what you think." Era shook her head, her chest tightening with anger and betrayal. What is it then? You promised to set me free, and now you've brought him right to me. Krath's troops were closing in, their weapons raised. Draven stepped in front of her, his weapon aimed at Krath. Listen to me, he said, his voice low and urgent. I didn't betray you, but if we don't move now, none of this will matter. Era hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to believe him, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. Before she could make a decision, Krath's voice cut through the tension. Enough games, he said, raising one of his 4 arms. Seize them. The soldiers surged forward, their boots pounding against the rocky ground. Draven fired, taking down 2 of them with precise shots. But there were too many. Era gritted her teeth and raised her makeshift weapon, ready to fight, but it was hopeless. One of the soldiers grabbed her arm, yanking her away from Draven. She struggled, kicking and swinging the metal rod, but it was no use. Another soldier struck her in the stomach with the butt of his weapon, and she doubled over, gasping for air. Draven shouted her name, his voice filled with desperation. He tried to reach her, but Krath's towering form stepped between them. You've been a thorn in my side for far too long, Krath said, his voice dripping with malice. He raised a clawed hand, slashing at Draven and knocking him to the ground. Era's vision blurred as the soldiers dragged her away. She tried to focus to fight, but her body felt heavy, her limbs unresponsive. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was Draven, lying motionless on the ground as Krath loomed over him. Rising hero. Lyra's eyes fluttered open, her head pounding as harsh light filled her vision. She tried to move, but her wrists were bound tightly, the cold bite of metal digging into her skin. The room around her was sterile and metallic, its walls lined with alien consoles glowing faintly with strange symbols. The hum of machinery was omnipresent, vibrating through the floor beneath her. She wasn't alone. Krath stood across the room, his towering figure silhouetted against a wall of flickering monitors. He turned slowly, his insectoid features twisting into a cruel smile. Ah, you're awake, he said, his voice like the scrape of metal against stone. I was beginning to think Draven had overestimated your resilience. At the mention of Draven, Era's heart sank. The last she'd seen of him, he had been on the ground, unmoving, with Krath towering over him. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet Krath's gaze. What do you want from me? She demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. Krath chuckled, the sound low and menacing. What I'd always wanted, to remind your kind of their place. But now you've given me something more. Draven. The traitor thought he could play hero. Now he'll die for his foolishness. Era clenched her fists, her anger bubbling to the surface. If you think I'll help you, you're wrong. Krath's smile widened. Help. Oh, my dear, you've already helped. By leading me to that ruin, you've given me access to something far more valuable than you or Draven. The obelisk. With its power, I can crush the human resistance once and for all. Era's blood ran cold. The obelisk, the ancient structure they'd stumbled upon, wasn't just a relic. It was a weapon, and now it was in Krath's hands. She couldn't let him use it, no matter the cost. Before Krath could say more, the door to the room hissed open, and a pair of guards entered, dragging a battered but conscious Draven between them. His face was bloodied, his movements sluggish, but his eyes still burned with defiance. Still alive, Krath mused, approaching Draven. Humans are surprisingly durable. Draven spat a mixture of blood and defiance at Krath's feet. You've already lost. You just don't know it yet. Krath's expression darkened, bold words for a dead man. Era's mind raced as Krath turned his attention back to Draven. The guards were distracted, and the bindings on her wrists, while tight, weren't unbreakable. She glanced around the room, searching for anything she could use. Her eyes landed on a small control panel on the wall, its surface flickering with alien symbols. If she could reach it, maybe she could disrupt the power or trigger an alarm. Anything to create a distraction. Draven caught her gaze, his expression shifting subtly. She realized he was stalling, buying her time. Her heart clenched, but she nodded slightly, signaling her understanding. Krath loomed over Draven, his claws gleaming. "Tell me, human," he sneered. "Do you regret your pathetic rebellion now?" Draven smirked, his voice weak but defiant. "Not even a little." Krath raised a clawed hand, ready to strike. Era seized the moment. With all her strength, she wrenched her wrists against the bindings, the metal cutting into her skin. The pain was sharp, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins drowned it out. The bindings snapped, and Era lunged for the control panel. Her fingers danced over the alien symbols, her instincts guiding her as she pressed buttons at random. Alarms blared, the lights in the room flickering wildly. "What?" Krath snarled, spinning toward her. Era grabbed a fallen guard's weapon and fired. The energy blast struck the console behind Krath, sending sparks flying. The alien overlord roared in anger, his claws swiping at the air as smoke filled the room. Draven took advantage of the chaos, elbowing one of the guards and grabbing his weapon. He moved with surprising speed despite his injuries, taking out the second guard with a precise shot. "Nice timing," Draven said, limping toward Era. "I couldn't let you have all the fun," she replied, handing him another weapon. The room shook as an explosion echoed from the direction of the obelisk. Krath's face twisted with fury as he regained his footing, his eyes glowing with hatred. "You've doomed yourselves," he spat. "The obelisk's power cannot be contained. You'll die here, just like the rest of your kind." Era raised her weapon, her hand steady. "Not today." Draven grabbed her arm. "We can't fight him here. We need to stop the obelisk before it's too late." Reluctantly, Era nodded, and they bolted from the room. The corridors of Krath's ship were chaotic, filled with flashing lights and blaring alarms. Guards scrambled in every direction, but the confusion worked to their advantage. As they neared the ship's exit, Draven slowed, his face grim. "There's no turning back now," he said. "Once we leave this ship, it's all or nothing." Era met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "Then let's make it count." The ship's hangar doors loomed ahead, and beyond them, the ruin and the glowing obelisk pulsed ominously. Era and Draven exchanged a glance before stepping into the open air, ready to face whatever horrors awaited them. Freedom and love. The air outside Krath's ship was electric, charged with the energy emanating from the obelisk. The ancient structure stood at the center of the canyon, its glowing symbols now pulsating erratically, casting eerie shadows across the jagged cliffs. The ground trembled beneath Era's feet as she and Draven sprinted toward it. Behind them, Krath's forces poured out of the ship, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Overhead, the sky churned with storm clouds, lightning arcing between them, as if the obelisk was tearing the very fabric of the planet apart. "Draven," Era called, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "What happens if that thing fully activates?" Draven didn't look back. "It'll wipe out everything for miles. Maybe the entire planet. Krath wanted to control it, but he's pushed it too far. If we don't shut it down, we're all dead." Era's heart pounded as they reached the base of the obelisk. Up close, it was even more intimidating, its surface alive with shifting symbols that seemed to ripple and writhe under her gaze. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, growing louder with every passing second. Draven knelt by a panel embedded in the obelisk's base, his hands moving quickly over the alien controls. "I need time to deactivate it," he said. "Cover me." Era nodded, gripping her weapon tightly. She turned to face the canyon, where Krath's soldiers were closing in. Their alien voices carried over the din, barking orders as they advanced in formation. Era's hands shook, but she forced herself to focus. These creatures had stolen her freedom, treated her like property. She wouldn't let them take anything more. The first soldier rounded the corner, and Era fired. The energy blast hit its mark, sending the alien sprawling. Another followed, and another. She aimed and fired, her movements becoming smoother, more confident with each shot. "Era," Draven shouted over his shoulder. "They're flanking." She turned just in time to see a group of soldiers scaling the cliffs to her left, their weapons aimed at Draven. Panic surged through her, but she pushed it down. Taking a deep breath, she fired, her shots precise and deliberate. The soldiers fell one by one, their bodies tumbling down the rocky slope. Draven cursed under his breath as sparks erupted from the panel. "This isn't working," he said, slamming his fist against the controls. "The obelisk systems are too damaged. It's not responding." Era's chest tightened. "What do we do?" Draven hesitated, his jaw clenched. Then his gaze shifted to the glowing core at the center of the obelisk. "We have to destroy it." "Destroy it?" Era echoed, her voice rising. "Didn't you just say that would kill us?" Draven met her eyes, his expression grim. "If we overload the core, it'll neutralize the obelisk, but it'll trigger an explosion. We'll only have seconds to get clear." Era stared at him, her mind racing. "There's no guarantee we'll survive that." Draven placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and grounding. "There's no guarantee we'll survive if we don't. But I won't let Krath win. Not now. Not ever." She searched his face, looking for doubt, hesitation, anything that might suggest another way. But there was only determination. Finally, she nodded. "Let's do it." Draven turned back to the obelisk, his hands moving over the controls with renewed urgency. The symbols on its surface flared brighter, the hum escalating into a deafening roar. Era could feel the heat radiating from the structure, the air around it rippling like a mirage. Behind her, Kraft's voice rang out, cold and commanding. "Enough." Era spun around to see the Overlord striding toward them, his soldiers parting to let him pass. His claws gleamed in the flickering light, and his eyes burned with rage. "You think you can defy me? I am the master of this galaxy. You are nothing." Era raised her weapon, her hand steady despite the fear knotting her stomach. "We're more than you'll ever understand," she said, her voice firm. Krath sneered, bold words from a slave. Before he could move, Draven shouted, "Era, now." Era turned back to see him pulling a small device from his belt. He slammed it against the obelisk's core, and the structure let out a piercing wail. The ground shook violently, and cracks spiderwebbed across the obelisk's surface. "It's going to blow." Draven yelled, grabbing her hand. "Run." They sprinted toward the canyon, the soldiers scattering in confusion as the obelisk's glow intensified. Krath roared in fury, his voice drowned out by the rising cacophony. Era didn't look back, her focus on the path ahead. They dove behind a rocky outcrop just as the obelisk exploded. The blast was blinding, a shockwave tearing through the canyon and knocking them off their feet. Heat and light enveloped them. And for a moment, Era thought this was the end. But then the world went quiet. Era opened her eyes to find herself lying on the ground, her ears ringing. Draven was beside her, his face streaked with dirt but alive. She let out a shaky breath, relief flooding her. "We did it," she whispered. Draven smiled faintly. "Yeah, we did." Around them, the canyon was eerily still. The obelisk was gone, its remains scattered across the ground. Kraft's forces had vanished, either killed in the blast or fled. For the first time in years, Era felt a flicker of hope. Draven sat up, his expression softening as he looked at her. "You were incredible back there," he said. "I couldn't have done this without you." Era met his gaze, her chest tightening. "You gave me a chance," she said. "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the weight of everything they'd been through seemed to lift. In that quiet, shattered canyon, surrounded by the remnants of their struggle, they found something neither of them had dared to hope for: peace. As they stood and began their journey back to the ship, Era felt a newfound strength coursing through her. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was free. And with Draven by her side, She knew they could face whatever came next.